There are moments in your life that act as doorways. Most of the time, you do not even realize you are standing on the threshold until you have already stepped through and the lock has clicked softly shut behind you. You find yourself in a new room, the air different, the light changed, and you can never quite get back to the hallway you were in before. For me, that doorway was not a grand, arching cathedral entrance, but the small, quiet space on my worn leather couch, the space right next to me, which had, over the course of a single season, become the most contested and sacred territory in my entire world. It was the space where Caleb slept, and in doing so, he remade the architecture of my life, turning my carefully constructed emotional solitude into a shared home I had never known I was building. He was asleep now, a dead weight against my side, his head pillowed on my shoulder. The faint, clean scent of his shampoo, something with sandalwood and citrus that was so distinctly him, filled the small space between us. One of his arms was thrown carelessly across my stomach, his hand resting limply on my hip, fingers slightly curled. In sleep, the restless energy that always hummed just beneath his skin had finally stilled, and the guarded tension in his jaw had gone soft. He looked younger this way, defenseless, the carefully maintained facade of the easygoing, ever-confident son of Pastor David Miller completely dismantled. This was the Caleb I knew, the one who only ever seemed to exist in the quiet, shadowed hours after midnight, within the four walls of my small apartment. It was a version of him I hoarded like a secret, a photograph developed in a darkroom that was only ever meant for my eyes. I had long ago memorized the rhythm of his breathing in sleep, the way it would start shallow and quick as he first drifted off, a final remnant of his waking anxiety, before deepening into a slow, oceanic cadence that seemed to pull the very silence of the room into its tide. I had learned to match my own breath to his, a subconscious act of synchronicity, as if my body were trying to anchor him to this safe harbor, to keep him from being swept away by whatever turbulent dreams crashed against the shores of his mind. My television was muted, casting a flickering, ghostly blue light across the room, painting shifting landscapes on his face. I could see the faint constellation of freckles across the bridge of his nose, the tiny scar that bisected his left eyebrow from a childhood fall, the way his eyelashes, surprisingly long and dark, brushed against his cheek. Every detail was a line in a poem I was terrified to write, but could not stop composing in my head. My own body was a study in stillness, a statue carved from equal parts longing and fear. My left leg had gone numb an hour ago, and a dull ache was beginning to form in my neck from the awkward angle, but I would not have moved for anything. To shift, to even breathe too deeply, felt like it would be a betrayal of some unspoken trust, a shattering of the fragile terrarium we had built in the middle of my living room. This proximity was a language we had invented without a lexicon, a series of gestures and movements that said everything and nothing at all. It was a nightly ritual born of his unspoken need and my silent acquiescence. He would show up at my door, his keys jingling a nervous rhythm in his hand, a tired smile not quite reaching his eyes, and he would say something about not wanting to be alone or about his own apartment feeling too empty. And I, the quiet observer, the chronicler of his moods, would simply step aside and let him in, knowing that the couch would eventually become a bed, and my shoulder, a pillow. This was the tightrope I walked. Every night, I balanced on the knife's edge between friendship and something more, something terrifying and beautiful that neither of us dared to name. He was the pastor's son, a pillar of a world I did not belong to, a world of Sunday sermons and community potlucks, and a specific, unyielding definition of love. I was the secret he kept, perhaps even from himself, the quiet anomaly in his well-ordered life. And as I sat there in the blue-tinged darkness, with the weight of him grounding me, a single, devastating thought rose to the surface, clear and sharp as a shard of glass. I was irrevocably in love with him. It was not a new realization, but in the profound stillness of that moment, it felt less like a feeling and more like a fact, as undeniable and essential as the beating of my own heart against his sleeping form. This doorway had been crossed. The lock had clicked, And I knew, with a certainty that was both a comfort and a terror, that I could never go back. Our story did not begin in the hushed intimacy of late-night confessions on a couch. It began under the harsh, fluorescent glare of a university gymnasium, to the cacophony of squeaking sneakers and the sharp, percussive slap of volleyballs against the floor. I had joined the club team as a way to force myself out of the solitary confines of my photography studio, a reluctant attempt at the well-rounded college experience my advisor was always mentioning. I was a competent player, quiet and methodical, my height giving me an advantage at the net that compensated for my lack of aggressive fervor. I preferred the periphery, the steady role of a blocker, observing the game's flow and anticipating the opponent's moves. It was a role that suited me. I was, by nature, an observer. Caleb was the opposite. He was the team's star setter, a whirlwind of kinetic energy and effortless charisma. He moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost unfair, directing the game with shouts of encouragement and subtle hand signals. He was the sun around which the rest of us orbited, his laughter loud and infectious, his smile a casual beacon that drew people in. He was, in every conceivable way, the center of things. He came with a reputation that preceded him. David Miller's boy, the one who led youth group back home, the one who was dating Sarah, a sweet, bright girl from his church, the one who was universally, uncomplainingly liked. He was a portrait of wholesome, all-American promise, and from my quiet corner of the court, I studied him like a composition, a study in light and motion that I could never quite capture. I had kept my distance at first, content to be a background character in the narrative of his college life. My own world was one of quiet spaces, the chemical-scented darkroom, the dusty corners of the library, the solitary walks I took with my camera at dawn. I had my own carefully curated loneliness, a fortress I had built to protect a part of myself I did not know how to share. But Caleb had a gravitational pull that was impossible to resist entirely. He was the one who insisted the whole team go out for pizza after a win, the one who organized study groups for shared general education classes, the one who made a point of learning everyone's name and something specific about them. He learned that I was a photography major, and one afternoon, he cornered me after practice, his face flushed with exertion, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Hey, Alex, right?" he'd asked, his voice still breathless. "I heard you the camera guy. We need some decent shots for the club's website. The ones we have look like they were taken with a potato," he grinned, and it was like a sudden burst of sunlight in the dim, cavernous gym. I remember feeling a strange, fluttery panic in my chest, a feeling of being seen when my entire existence was predicated on being the one who sees. I mumbled something noncommittal about being busy with coursework, but he was persistent in the most charming, unassuming way possible. "Just a few games," he pressed. "I'll even buy the pizza. Please. You'd be saving us from eternal online shame." And so I began to photograph him. At first, it was just part of the game, my lens capturing the peak of his jump, the intense focus in his eyes as he set the ball, the explosive joy of a point well played. But soon, my focus narrowed. I started to notice the details that existed between the big moments. The way he would run a hand through his sweat-dampened hair in frustration, the unconscious habit he had of biting his lower lip when a match was close, the quiet, encouraging words he would murmur to a teammate who had made a mistake. My camera became an excuse, a shield that allowed me to look, really look, at him without seeming strange. I was not staring, I was working, I was documenting. But in the silent solitude of my darkroom, as his image emerged from the chemical bath, floating up from the white paper like a ghost, I knew I was doing something else entirely. I was falling in love. Our friendship grew organically from those moments. He would come over to my small, off-campus apartment to look at the contact sheets, and what started as a 5-minute errand would stretch into hours. We would talk about everything and nothing: classes, volleyball, terrible movies, the strange loneliness of being surrounded by thousands of people on a campus that felt like its own city. I learned that the easy confidence was a carefully constructed armor. Beneath it, there was a restlessness, a deep-seated need to please everyone, especially his father. He spoke of his dad with a mixture of profound love and suffocating reverence. "He's the best man I know," he told me once, his eyes fixed on some distant point outside my window. I hope I can be half the man he is." There was a weight to his words, the burden of an expectation he felt he could never truly meet. He talked about Sarah, his girlfriend back home, in a way that was affectionate but distant, as if he were describing a character in a book he was supposed to love. He never seemed to light up when he spoke of her the way he did when he talked about a perfectly executed play or a challenging hike he wanted to take. I, in turn, kept my own counsel. He knew I was quiet, that I preferred observing to participating, but he never pressed me for the reasons why. He seemed to accept my silent nature as a fundamental part of who I was, a calm harbor to his own restless energy. He never asked why I never dated, why I always spent holidays with my aunt in another state instead of with my parents. There were rooms within me whose doors I kept firmly locked, and he never, not once, tried the handles. He just seemed content to sit with me in the hallway. Our friendship was a comfortable silence, a space where we could both just be, without the pressure of performance. And for a long time, that was more than enough. I convinced myself it was all I would ever need. The shift began with a phone call. It was a Tuesday night in late October, the air outside my apartment window holding the first real chill of autumn. I was in my darkroom, the red safe light casting an eerie, monastic glow on the equipment, when my phone, which I usually left on silent, buzzed insistently on the counter. It was Caleb. His voice on the other end was hollow, a faint echo of its usual vibrant timbre. "Hey, you busy?" "Just developing some film," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the small, soundproof space. "What's up? You sound off." There was a long pause, filled with a static that sounded less like a bad connection and more like the sound of a universe collapsing. "Sarah and I broke up," he said finally, the words flat and devoid of emotion, like stones dropped into a deep well. It was not the news itself that surprised me. I had long sensed the inevitability of it, the way he spoke of their future as a duty rather than a desire, but the profound emptiness in his voice. It was a void where I expected to hear anger, or sadness, or even relief. There was just nothing. "Oh," I said, the syllable utterly inadequate. "Caleb, I'm sorry. Are you okay?" Another pause. I could hear his breath, shaky and uneven. "I do not know what I am," he whispered, and the confession seemed to cost him everything. Can I come over?" "I do not want to be at my place right now." His apartment, a sterile two-bedroom he shared with another player from the team, was famously immaculate, a place where nothing was ever out of order. Mine, by contrast, was a controlled chaos of stacked books, camera equipment, and drying prints clipped to a line strung across the living room. It was a space that was lived in, a space that was mine. It was, I realized in that moment, a space he considered safe. "Of course," I said immediately. The doors unlocked. When he arrived 10 minutes later, he looked like a ship that had been battered by a storm I could not see. His shoulders were slumped, his hair was a mess, and his eyes, normally so bright and engaged, were shadowed and distant. He was not crying, but he looked worse than if he had been. He looked broken. He did not say anything as he came in, just walked to my couch and collapsed into it, burying his face in his hands. I did not know what to do. All my instincts as a photographer, as an observer, were useless here. I could not frame this pain, could not capture it on film to understand it later. I had to exist in it with him. So I did the only thing I could think of. I made him a cup of tea, the way my aunt used to for me when I was a kid and the world felt too big and loud. He took the mug with hands that trembled slightly, the steam fogging the space in front of his face. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the hum of my old refrigerator and the distant wail of a siren. I did not push him to talk. I just sat in the armchair across from him, a silent sentinel, letting my presence be an anchor. Finally, he spoke, his voice raspy. "It was my fault," he said, not looking at me. "She wanted to talk about a wedding, a timeline. She had it all planned out. The church, the house with the white fence, 2.5 kids. The whole thing." He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. It's what everyone expects. My parents. Her parents. It's the path, but it's not the path you want. I finished for him. The words a quiet statement, not a question. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, terrifying confusion. I do not know what I want, Alex, he said, his voice cracking. That's the problem. I feel like I've been playing a part for so long. I've forgotten who I am when the curtain comes down. Being the pastor's son, being Sarah's boyfriend, being the team captain. It's all a costume. And I took it off tonight, and there's nothing underneath. The rawness of his confession stunned me. It was a glimpse behind the veil, a look into the carefully guarded rooms of his own interior world. He was not just mourning the end of a relationship. He was mourning the loss of a script that had guided his entire life. The crisis was not external. It was a profound, internal unraveling. He was lost, and for some reason, he had navigated his way here, to my quiet apartment, to my steady, non-judgmental silence. He stayed late that night, long after the tea was cold and the conversation had dwindled back into a shared quiet. He did not go home. He fell asleep right there, on my couch, fully clothed, one arm dangling off the edge, his face turned away from the light. I found a blanket and draped it over him, my fingers brushing against his shoulder for a fraction of a second too long. It was the first time he had ever stayed the night. It would not be the last. That night, the architecture of our friendship began to change, its old blueprints discarded, its new foundations laid in the uncertain soil of his quiet devastation and my silent, patient hope. That first night established the new pattern. It began as a trickle and soon became a river, a current that pulled him toward my apartment with an increasing, undeniable force. At first, there were always reasons, plausible veneers for his need to be near. My roommate's having people over, it's too loud to study, he would text, or, I finished that project, want to watch that terrible sci-fi movie we talked about? Each excuse was a key he used to unlock my door, and I always let him turn it. I became an expert in the art of plausible deniability, both his and my own. He was not seeking me out. He was seeking refuge. I was not harboring a secret, hopeless love. I was being a good friend. We were two actors in a play of our own devising, and we both knew our lines perfectly. The couch was his designated space, a separate territory within my own. But slowly, imperceptibly, the boundaries began to blur. It started with him falling asleep during a movie, his head gradually listing until it came to rest on my shoulder. The first time it happened, my entire body went rigid. I was hyper-aware of every point of contact. The surprisingly soft texture of his hair against my neck, the warmth of him seeping through my shirt, the gentle pressure of his weight. I sat there for 2 hours, my arm tingling, my heart hammering a frantic, silent rhythm against my ribs, until the credits rolled and the screen went black. I did not wake him. I could not. It felt like disturbing a fragile, sleeping creature that had, against all odds, chosen to trust me. This became the ritual. Movie nights, study sessions, or simple, quiet evenings would end with Caleb asleep against me. The act itself became a silent conversation. His slow drift into sleep was a declaration of trust, an act of surrender. My stillness was my acceptance, my promise to keep watch. I learned to read the subtle shifts in his sleeping form, the way his breathing would hitch in a moment of a stressful dream, the way his hand would sometimes clench in mine if our fingers were laced together on the cushion between us. These moments were exquisite torture. They were everything I had ever wanted and a stark reminder of everything I could not have. He was seeking comfort, a human anchor in the storm of his own confusion. I was just the closest, safest port. To mistake it for anything more, I told myself, would be a fatal error in navigation. My internal monologue during those weeks was a relentless cycle of analysis and second-guessing. I would replay every interaction, every shared glance, every lingering touch, searching for meaning. Did he lean into me just now, or was I imagining it? Was his hand on my knee a casual gesture, or did it rest there a second too long? It was like trying to develop a photograph with the wrong chemicals, the image always emerging blurry and indistinct. open to 1,000 different interpretations. I was a cartographer mapping an emotional landscape that changed its geography from one moment to the next. The anxiety was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my days, but it was overshadowed by the profound, aching tenderness I felt for him. Seeing him so vulnerable, so stripped of his usual armor, only deepened my feelings. I wanted to protect him, not just from the world, but from the war he was waging within himself. The couch, once a sufficient buffer, eventually proved inadequate. The nights grew colder as winter tightened its grip on the city, and my apartment, with its old, drafty windows, was never quite warm enough. One night, after he had fallen asleep in his usual spot against my shoulder, I gently tried to rouse him. "Caleb," I whispered, "come on, you should get to bed. You'll be sore in the morning." He mumbled something incoherent, his face buried in my sweatshirt. He made a half-hearted attempt to stand, stumbled, and then looked at me with eyes clouded with sleep. "It's cold," he mumbled, a simple, childlike complaint. The words were out of my mouth before I could stop them. "You can take my bed." "I'll take the couch." He shook his head, a slow, groggy motion. "No, man, it's your bed." He paused, and in that small space of silence, a new possibility presented itself, hanging in the air between us, shimmering and dangerous. "It's big enough," he said, his voice quiet, almost a question. "We can just sleep." "It's warmer." My heart stopped. Or maybe it started beating so fast it felt like it had stopped. It was a perfectly logical suggestion, a practical solution to a simple problem. My bed was a queen, more than enough space for two people who were just friends to share without it meaning anything. It was a rationalization so flimsy it was transparent, and yet we both clung to it as if it were a life raft. "Okay," I heard myself say, my voice sounding distant, as if it belonged to someone else, someone far braver than I was. That first night in the same bed was a universe of unspoken tension. We lay on our respective sides, a chasm of a few inches of mattress between us, both of us preternaturally still, as if we were afraid a single movement would give away the truth of the moment. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could hear every tiny shift of fabric as he adjusted his pillow. I stared at the ceiling in the darkness, my mind racing. This was a new level of intimacy, a new, more dangerous phase of our ritual. The plausible deniability was wearing thin, the excuses becoming more and more fragile. We were no longer just friends sharing a space. We were two people deliberately, if silently, choosing to close a distance that had once been sacrosanct. Sleep felt impossible. But then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard his breathing begin to deepen, to fall into that familiar, steady rhythm. Hesitantly, as if drawn by a magnetic force I could not fight, he shifted in his sleep, rolling onto his side to face me, and one of his arms came to rest on my waist. It was a simple, unconscious gesture, but in the silent, charged darkness of my bedroom, it felt like a confession. And as I finally let myself drift into a fitful sleep, I knew we were standing on a threshold, and the door was about to swing wide open. The ritual of sharing a bed became our new normal, an unspoken agreement forged in the cold of winter and the warmth of shared body heat. The pretense of practicality faded quickly, leaving behind the quiet, unacknowledged truth. We simply did not want to sleep apart. The first few nights were marked by a careful, almost reverent, distance. We would lie back to back, a deliberate wall of space between us. But sleep is a great betrayer of conscious intent. In the unguarded hours of the night, our bodies would find their way back to each other, drawn together by some primal need for comfort and warmth. I would wake in the middle of the night to find his arm draped over me, or my head tucked into the curve of his shoulder, our legs tangled together under the blankets. These moments felt stolen, precious, and illicit. In the morning, we would wake up and pretend not to notice, moving apart with a practiced casualness that was its own form of intimacy, a shared conspiracy of silence. For me, those nights were a symphony of sensory details, each one a note in a composition of longing. I memorized the feeling of his calloused fingers against my skin, the soft tickle of his breath on the back of my neck, the solid, grounding pressure of his chest against my back. Sometimes, I would lie awake long after he had fallen asleep, just listening to the sound of his heart beating, a steady, rhythmic drum that seemed to be the only thing holding the world together. It was a dangerous addiction, this proximity. I was living within the pages of my most secret fantasy, but it was a story in which I was a ghost, a silent observer of my own happiness. I was a body providing warmth, a presence warding off nightmares, but I was not a lover. I was a placeholder for a comfort he did not know how to ask for in the light of day. The tension was building, a static charge in the air between us that grew more potent with each passing night. The line between friendship and something more had become so blurred it was practically invisible, a border on a map that no longer corresponded to the actual terrain. We were living in a new country, one without a name, and we did not know the laws. The silence that had once been comfortable became fraught with unspoken questions. I could feel them hanging in the air when he would look at me for a moment too long, or when his hand would linger on my arm as he passed me in the narrow hallway. A storm was gathering just over the horizon, and I could feel the barometric pressure dropping in my own heart. I was terrified of the lightning strike that I knew must come, the one that would either illuminate everything or burn our fragile shelter to the ground. It happened on a Thursday. It had been a long week of midterms for both of us, a blur of late-night study sessions fueled by cheap coffee and mutual exhaustion. That night, there was no movie, no pretense of doing anything other than collapsing. We fell into bed like two soldiers at the end of a long battle, the silence in the room heavy with a shared weariness. For a long time, we just lay there on our backs, staring at the familiar shadows the streetlights painted on my ceiling. The usual careful distance was gone. Our shoulders were pressed together, our arms brushing. Then, Caleb broke the silence. His voice was soft, barely a whisper in the dark. "Alex." "Yeah," I said, my own voice tight. I did not turn to look at him. I kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if the plaster and paint held some answer I desperately needed. There was a long, drawn-out pause, a space so full of weight it felt like I could not breathe. I could feel him shift, turning onto his side to face me. I felt his gaze on the side of my face, a tangible heat. I braced myself for a question about a class, a complaint about a professor, anything that would return us to the safe, charted territory of our friendship. "Can I ask you something?" he said, and the vulnerability in his tone was a physical thing, a crack in the armor I could feel in my own chest. "You can always ask me anything," I whispered, and I meant it. Another pause. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. This was it. This was the threshold. "Would it be okay?" he began, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. "If I kissed you?" The world stopped. The shadows on the ceiling froze. The distant sound of traffic faded to nothing. The question was not one of passion or of demand. It was a plea for permission, an act of profound, terrifying vulnerability. It was him, the pastor's son, the one who lived his life by a script written by others, finally admitting that he did not know his lines. He was asking me to help him write a new scene. I finally turned my head, and in the dim light filtering through the window, I could see his face. His eyes were wide, searching mine, full of a mixture of fear and a fragile, burgeoning hope. He was not the confident team captain, not the charming son. He was just Caleb, lost and uncertain and beautiful. I did not answer with words. There were no words that could contain the seismic shift that was happening inside me, the tectonic plates of my carefully guarded heart grinding together to form a new continent. Instead, I lifted my hand and gently cupped his jaw, my thumb stroking the faint stubble on his cheek. I leaned in, closing the final, infinitesimal distance between us, and I kissed him. It was not a kiss of fire or force. It was a kiss of quiet discovery, as tentative and gentle as a prayer. It was soft and hesitant, a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of coffee and exhaustion and the unspoken things we had been holding in for months. In that single, breathtaking moment, the storm that had been gathering for so long finally broke. And it was not a destructive tempest. It was a soft, cleansing rain. We had crossed the line, and on the other side, I found not a wasteland of ruined friendship, but the quiet, hopeful beginnings of a new, uncharted world. The morning after the kiss was a study in fragile, shimmering silence. When I awoke, the first light of dawn was filtering through the blinds, striping the room in pale gray and gold. Caleb was still asleep, his back to me, but the space between us was gone. In the night, we had migrated to the very center of the bed, our bodies curled together like two halves of a whole. His hand was resting on my hip, and my arm was tucked under his pillow, my fingers close to his hair. For a few perfect, crystalline moments, I allowed myself to simply exist in this new reality. The air felt different, charged with the memory of what had passed between us. It felt like the first quiet moment after a fever breaks, a feeling of peace that was so profound it was almost painful. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for months was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant calm. We had crossed over. We were here. But as the sun climbed higher, casting a brighter, more revealing light into the room, the fear began to seep back in, a slow, cold tide. Caleb stirred, his breathing changing as he drifted toward wakefulness. I held my breath. What would happen now? Would he pull away? Would he pretend it never happened, dismissing it as a moment of exhaustion-fueled confusion? The silence stretched as he slowly became aware of his surroundings, of our proximity. I felt the muscles in his back tense, a subtle but undeniable shift from soft, sleeping warmth to guarded, waking alertness. Slowly he moved. He did not pull away violently, but he disentangled himself from me with a quiet, deliberate finality. He sat up on the edge of the bed, his back still to me, and ran a hand through his messy hair. He did not speak. The silence in the room was now a different kind of silence. It was not the comfortable quiet of our friendship, nor the charged stillness of the night before. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of uncertainty. I could almost see the thoughts warring in his head, the conflict playing out in the rigid set of his shoulders. "Caleb," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He flinched, as if my voice had been a physical touch. "I have to go," he said, his own voice low and rough. He stood up and started pulling on his jeans from the day before, his movements jerky and hurried. "I have an early class I forgot about. It was a lie, and we both knew it." It was Friday. His first class was not until 11. My heart, which had felt so full and calm just moments before, began to ache with a familiar, crushing weight. I had misread everything. The kiss had not been a beginning. It had been a mistake. A boundary crossed that he now regretted with every fiber of his being. I felt a fool, exposed and naive. "Okay," I said, my voice flat, betraying none of the chaos erupting inside me. I watched as he grabbed his sweatshirt, his keys. He would not look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the door, on his escape route. He was a cornered animal, and I was the source of his fear. At the bedroom door, he finally paused, his hand on the knob. He still did not turn around. I'll see you later," he mumbled, and then he was gone. I heard the front door open and click shut, and the apartment was plunged back into a silence that was now profoundly, devastatingly empty. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. Caleb became a ghost. He answered my texts with short, non-committal replies hours after I sent them. He was suddenly swamped with coursework. He had to help a friend move. He was picking up extra shifts at his part-time campus job. The excuses were a transparent, flimsy wall he was building between us, brick by painful brick. At volleyball practice, he avoided my eyes, his usual easygoing chatter replaced by a clipped, focused intensity. He was there, but he was gone. The easy camaraderie we had shared was replaced by an awkward, painful distance that everyone on the team seemed to notice, though no one commented on it. I was adrift. The quiet harbor of our friendship had been destroyed, and the new world I had glimpsed was a mirage. I spent my hours in a haze of hurt and confusion, replaying the kiss, his question, over and over in my mind. Had I forced him? Had I taken advantage of his vulnerability? The self-doubt was a corrosive acid, eating away at the fragile hope that had bloomed in my chest. I retreated back into my own fortress of solitude, my camera, my only companion. I walked the city for hours, taking pictures of strangers, of stark architectural lines, of lonely landscapes, trying to frame my own heartbreak, to put it outside of myself so I could understand it. But it was no use. The pain was not a subject I could capture. It was the lens through which I now saw the world. After a week of this agonizing silence, I knew I could not go on. The uncertainty was worse than any rejection. I needed to know the truth, even if it was the truth I feared the most. I needed to hear him say it was a mistake, that we were just friends, that we should forget it ever happened. I could survive the truth. I could rebuild on the ruins. But I could not live in the wreckage of this silence. I went to his apartment on a Sunday evening. It was raining, a cold, miserable drizzle that matched the state of my soul. I stood outside his door for a full 5 minutes, my heart pounding, my resolve wavering. I could just go home. I could let it go, let our friendship die a slow, silent death. But the memory of his question in the dark, would it be okay, would not let me. That question had come from a place of genuine, terrifying honesty. He deserved the same from me. I knocked. He opened the door, and his face was a mask of surprise that quickly morphed into something that looked like guilt or fear. He looked tired, older than he had a week ago. There were dark circles under his eyes. "Alex," he said, his voice quiet. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said, my own voice steadier than I expected it to be. "Can I come in?" He hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside, letting me into the impossibly neat and impersonal space. It smelled of air freshener and nothing else. It was not a home. It was a holding cell. He did not invite me to sit. We stood in the small entryway, the tension a third person in the room with us. "I am not going to pretend," I began, my gaze locked on his, forcing him to meet my eyes. "I am not going to pretend that last week did not happen. And I cannot live in this silence anymore, Caleb. It's killing me." My voice trembled on the last words, but I did not let it break. "If it was a mistake, just tell me. If you regret it, just say the words. I am strong enough to hear it. I will walk away, and I will leave you alone. But you have to talk to me. After everything, I deserve that." He finally looked at me, and his carefully constructed composure shattered. His eyes filled with tears, and his face crumpled. The sob that escaped him was a raw, ragged sound of pure anguish. "It was not a mistake," he choked out, the words torn from him. "That's the problem. It's the only thing in my entire life that has ever felt real." He collapsed onto his couch, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. I stood there, frozen for a moment, my own anger and hurt dissolving in the face of his overwhelming pain. This was not about me. It had never been just about me. This was about the war he was fighting inside himself, the war between who he was and who he was supposed to be. I crossed the room and sat down next to him, not touching him, just closing the distance. "Then why?" I asked gently. "Why did you run?" He took a long, shuddering breath, trying to regain control. "Because I'm a coward," he whispered, his voice thick with self-loathing. "Because the moment I woke up next to you, and it felt right. It felt like coming home. And it terrified me. All I could hear was my father's voice in my head. All I could see were the disappointed faces of everyone I have ever known. My whole life, I've had this path laid out for me. College, Sarah, a good job, a family, a respectable life. And you, being with you. It sets that whole path on fire." He looked at me, his eyes pleading, desperate for me to understand. I do not know how to be the person who holds the match. His confession laid it all bare. The conflict, the fear, the crushing weight of expectation he had been carrying his entire life. He was not rejecting me. He was terrified of accepting himself. The love I felt for him swelled in my chest, a fierce, protective thing. I finally reached out and placed my hand on his knee. "You do not have to do it alone," I said, my voice soft but firm. "You do not have to burn anything down. Maybe you just have to choose a different path. A quieter one. One that's your own." He looked at my hand on his knee, and then back up at my face. A single tear traced a path through the stubble on his cheek. "I do not know how," he whispered. "I do," I said. "You just start by taking one step. And you do not have to take it alone." He leaned forward then, and he did not kiss me. He just rested his forehead against mine, closing his eyes. His breath was warm against my face. "I am so sorry, Alex," he murmured. "I am so sorry for hurting you. I know," I said. And in that moment of shared, fragile honesty, amidst the wreckage of the past week, I felt the ground beneath us begin to solidify. The confrontation had not been an end. It was a clearing. We had finally spoken the truth in the light of day, and now, finally, we could begin to heal. The conversation in his apartment was not a magical fix. It did not erase his fear or untangle the complex knot of duty and identity that had defined his life. But it did open a door. It replaced the suffocating silence with the clean, sharp air of honesty. We began to talk, really talk, in a way we never had before. The days that followed were a slow, careful process of rebuilding, not back to what we were, but forward, into something new. We were architects of a new kind of relationship, and we were drawing the blueprints as we went. He still stayed at my apartment most nights, but the dynamic had shifted. The ritual was no longer an act of unspoken need and plausible deniability. It was an intentional choice. When he came to my bed now, it was not just for warmth or to escape his own empty room. It was to be with me. We would lie in the dark and talk for hours, his voice a low murmur as he unpacked a lifetime of expectations. He told me about the immense, gentle pressure of his father's love, a love that was conditional on a version of Caleb he was no longer sure he could be. He spoke of the guilt he felt, a deep, pervasive shame that had been ingrained in him since childhood, the feeling that this part of himself was a flaw, a sin, a secret that had to be prayed away. I tried. He confessed one night, his voice small in the darkness, his head resting on my chest. For years, I would lie in bed and pray that God would just take it away. Make me normal. Make me the son my father thinks I have. I held him tighter, my hand stroking his hair, my heart aching for the lonely boy he must have been. "There is nothing wrong with you, Caleb," I whispered into the darkness. "There is nothing to take away. You are not broken." These conversations were our darkroom, the safe, quiet space where the truth could slowly develop. I learned to be patient, to listen more than I spoke. My role was not to have the answers, but to be a steady presence, a mirror that reflected back to him the good, whole person I had always seen. I did not push him to label what we were, to define himself for my sake. I understood that the most important thing was for him to define himself for his own. My love for him had to be a harbor, not a cage. It had to be a space where he was free to be confused, to be afraid, to be uncertain. The physical intimacy between us evolved as well. It was gentle and exploratory, driven by comfort and reassurance more than passion. Kisses were soft and lingering, often exchanged in the quiet moments before sleep or in the hazy light of morning. We spent hours just holding each other, the simple act of touch, a language that spoke of safety and acceptance. For him, I think, it was a way of unlearning a lifetime of physical guardedness, of discovering that intimacy could be a source of peace, not shame. For me, it was the quiet, breathtaking fulfillment of a longing I had carried for years. To be able to touch him freely, to offer comfort and receive it in return, was a gift I never took for granted. Slowly, I began to see a change in him. A quiet confidence began to take root. He smiled more, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. The restless energy that had always hummed beneath his skin began to calm, replaced by a sense of centeredness. He was still the pastor's son, still the volleyball captain, but he was carrying those roles more lightly. They were no longer the sum of his identity, but just parts of a more complex, more authentic whole. He was learning to live in his own skin, and it was a beautiful, transformative thing to witness. Our world remained small and private, a bubble we carefully maintained. We did not hold hands on campus or tell our teammates. The risk of exposure, especially for him, was still too great, the consequences too seismic to contemplate just yet. But our privacy did not feel like a shameful secret anymore. It felt like a sacred space, a world we were building together, board by board, nail by nail, before we were ready to show it to anyone else. It was in the small, domestic moments that our new reality felt most solid. It was in the way he started leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom, a sweatshirt in my closet. It was in the way I started buying the kind of coffee he liked without even thinking about it. My apartment, once my solitary fortress, was slowly, quietly becoming our home. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of that same coffee brewing. I found him in my small kitchen, wearing one of my old t-shirts, moving with a comfortable, familiar ease in the space. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the particles of dust dancing in the air, casting a golden glow around him. He turned and saw me standing in the doorway, and a slow, easy smile spread across his face. It was a smile of pure, uncomplicated contentment. He did not say anything. He just held up a coffee mug, a silent offering. I walked over to him, took the mug, and stood beside him, our shoulders brushing as we looked out the window at the quiet street below. The silence between us was easy, full, a perfect sphere of shared understanding. We had been through the storm, the fear, the painful confrontation. We had navigated the treacherous waters of uncertainty. And we had arrived here, on this quiet shore, in the warm morning light. The path ahead was still uncertain. There were conversations he would eventually need to have with his family, a world he would need to learn to navigate as his true self. It would not be easy, but standing there with him, in the peaceful quiet of our shared kitchen, I felt a profound sense of hope. We had found our foundation not in grand declarations, but in the steady accumulation of small, honest moments. We had learned that home was not a place with four walls and a roof, but a feeling of safety you find in another person. He had been the secret I kept in my heart, and I had been the one he could not pray away. But here, in the quiet light of a new day, we were no longer secrets. We were just us, and we began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together.